All right, here we go. 2 Samuel, the 6th chapter is where we're going to be today. Sorry for the confusion. I know we left off in chapter 21 last week, but we're trying to get a little bit closer to chronology. Not doing a perfect job of that because I don't think we have perfect information on whether or not what the exact chronological sequence is. But this is a guess, and I'll just go with it for now. 2 Samuel chapter 6. And we'll begin reading there. Can I get someone to start us off with the first 11 verses of reading? Is anyone energetic enough to read 11 verses for us?
Read half.
Oh, okay. Can you two split it? How about that?
Okay, she can have that. David again brought together out of Israel chosen men, 30,000 in all. He and all his men set out from Bela of Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim that are on the ark. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on a hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with songs and with harps, lyres, and tambourines, sistrums, and cymbals.
When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day the place is called Perez Uzzah. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom and the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household.
Okay. A few weeks back we had a very good sermon on this. And something was pointed out in that sermon, and I want to give you guys an opportunity to bring it up first. Why is it? What was a possible explanation for Uzzah? Uzzah, one of the guys that should have known better, probably, why would he have ever bothered to touch the Ark of the Covenant? That's kind of a big no-no that everyone was familiar with. You do not touch the Ark of the Covenant. It symbolized the very presence of God. So what led to him, besides what we see read here, obviously, we know an oxen stumbled, but besides that, what led him to a point where he felt comfortable enough to touch it? Any thoughts on that?
It was supposed to be carried by poles,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't have the poles, so consequently it would have fallen.
It probably would have crashed. They did not research on how to carry the thing ahead of time. I hope that's the correct answer. I would like to think that they just didn't do their homework. If they did their homework, they were deliberately doing it differently than what God said. That's even worse. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt, though. I'm going to guess they didn't research it from the law. They just said, oh, the ark, great, let's put it in a cart, let's transport it the way we transport big, important, heavy items, you know?
And that was the way they got it
from the Philistines? Sure. That's how it came to them. So it worked for them. Why wouldn't it work for us? Yeah. Seems like good reasoning. Sure. You can go with that.
A new cart, didn't they?
Oh, yeah, you're right. And they put it on a new cart.
So at least they thought, given it some precedence.
Oh, yeah, that's true. This is brand new. Well, I think the Philistines put it on a new cart, and then they chopped it up and offered it as a sacrifice way back when. So what does it say here? Did they put it on a new cart again? Should have paid attention to that. Anyone see that? Yeah, on a new cart, verse 3. You're right. So it's not just any semi-truck transporting the goods. It is a brand new international. I mean, top of the line quality quality cart.
So
That
they
makes
probably didn't
sense.
bother to look and see how they should have done it.
Yeah,
Thought,
yeah.
This is great. We'll put this in the Cadillac.
Yes, Cadillac. The best ride you've got available is well. That just makes sense. You think, you know what? I want to do my best for you. There are people in the world, and this illustration works for me. It probably doesn't work for you or have nearly the impact for you as it does for me. But growing up, one of the bigger shocks of my life was to learn that there were people in this world that exist. They're real people. They don't like ice cream. They don't like ice cream. You need to let that sink in for a minute. Do you realize how wonderful ice cream is? Have you ever... there are some people in this world that I learned as a young kid don't like ice cream. And I looked at them like they had a third arm and a second head.
It gives them brain freeze.
Brain freeze or not, it's worth it. It's temporary. It's that good. You endure a little bit of pain for a good cause. Well, yeah. So some people, does that mean I'm right and they're wrong? No. Some people that never dawned on me. This just tastes so good. I thought everyone loved this stuff. It was that good. Well, to their credit, it probably never dawned on them to think of any other way to transport it. You transport it the best, safest means possible, and this is how you do it. It's not likely that we would think, oh, hey, let's go meet up over at the MiDA house after this. Yeah, let's go get bicycles and ride over there. That wouldn't occur to you probably. You'd think, I'm going to go get in my car and drive over there because that's what I do. It's just habit. And that's what I'm going to do too. I wouldn't think of any other way. But you're right, that was their problem. But Uzzah still, regardless, he knew not to touch it. So you're right, they're in a situation they shouldn't have been in. Uzzah, they knew better, but he still did it anyway. And one of the reasons that was pointed out in the message is that the ark had been dwelling at a place, at Abinadab's house. Who were Abinadab's sons? Ahio and Uzzah. The ark had been at his dad's house. That's his family house. He lived with the ark. It was another piece of furniture at his house. All of a sudden, the great piece of furniture that symbolized the very presence of God was just a piece of furniture in his house that, oh yeah, it's the ark. I walk by it every day. I see it all the time. He'd probably grown used to it. And by the time you grow used to something, it's not as significant anymore. It's not as, you don't have the exact same respect for somebody, for something anymore, and so you might treat it a little bit differently. Sort of like how there are a lot of people, and the Bible even says this, even a fool is thought wise if he keeps his mouth shut. Haven't you known some people that you're like, wow, they look really smart and intelligent, and then they open their mouth, and then, nope. And what's that saying? Better to, have people suspect you might be a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt? Yeah. But it is true. There's a little bit of this benefit of that, a little bit of this, that appears, things change once you get used to hearing something. Well, there's a lot of respected reverence for the ark. Most people would never see it in their lifetime. They'd probably hear about it, see depictions of it. But it's very different if it's just been sitting over there for years, So he probably got used to it. They didn't research, and he touched the ark. The thing I want us to think about, though, is if we were in a similar situation. Everyone, as best I can tell in this situation, meant well. Do you sense anyone here has ill intentions in regards to God's ark or God's name? Or yeah?
Well, kind of just for kicks and giggles, I guess. Mm-hmm. But do you think in any way that this could have been premeditated in a way?
Premeditated.
The reason why I wonder is because it says they put it into a new cart. Mm-hmm. I doubt that they picked it up over their shoulders and put it in there. They obviously moved it into a new cart in some sort of way. Mm-hmm. And like your dad pointed out in the sermon talking about, they lived with it. They just thought it was another kind of piece of furniture, but it could have also been one of those things that built up over time, and they put it in a cart, and then they're taking it, and it's kind of one of those things where it's like the kid who...
So they knew, but it's probably okay.
It's like the kid who wants to get a cookie out of the cookie jar and leaves the lid off the cookies and is allowing himself to be tempted to do it.
That's an interesting thought.
I don't know, just for
I'm glad you brought that up. That is an interesting thought, and that's a real possibility. Maybe they knew what you're supposed to do, but it doesn't really seem to matter. Nothing crazy happens when we walk by the ark or when we, who knows? It's entirely possible that they may have accidentally touched it one time and he scared himself to death, but he didn't die, Yeah. That's a possibility too. It doesn't say otherwise. I also find it interesting, back when we were studying this, when 70 people died at, I believe it was Beth Shemesh, because they looked inside of the ark. Well, how do you look inside of the ark? I mean, I guess you got to touch it and open the thing up, right? That's how you would look inside. So presumably they were allowed to live for a little while and then the punishment happened. So maybe that built up a false sense of confidence, perhaps. That's an interesting thought. But regardless, I think and I would hope that these people had good intentions. But even though they had good intentions, bad happened. God punished them because they did not do things the way he wanted. That's a powerful lesson for us, because if that happened to them, why won't that happen to us at times too? Sometimes you can get yourself in a situation where the only decision you make is going to be a bad decision. It's going to be wrong. Uzzah is a great example of this. He had two choices at that moment. Oxen stumbles, the thing's about to fall. What do? You either stabilize it or you let it crash. Which one's good? Neither. Neither decision is good. Both of them are pretty bad. That's just bad. You don't let that happen. So what was the mistake? The mistake was being in that situation in the first place. This is really, really huge in my opinion, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently. When we start to set up anything outside of God's will, just slightly, set up a slightly different system, we get into these situations all the time. That is what leads to, it might be fine on the surface, but that's what leads to a situation where these impossible situations happen. Unfortunately, all right, I'll give you an example. I think this applies. The church over the last, you'll have to help me out, 700 years, I'm guessing, something like that. 800 years, has slowly made exceptions and differences to this thing referred to as baptism. We've slowly made little changes where we think, you know what, sprinkling, that'll be okay, that'll cover it, even though that's not what the word meant. Well, it's important, yeah, but it's not necessarily essential. Let's just focus on the symbolism of it. It's making a statement, which it does, but that's not the only thing it does. And so now all the time, if you want to try to teach the truth about baptism, and you don't even have to try to start anything. All you have to do is read what the scripture says and just explain the way the scripture explains it. And almost always, anyone who's had a church background that has taught them otherwise, one of the first things they're going to say is, wait a minute, so what happens if you're not baptized? Now, what's the problem with me answering that question? What happens if you're not baptized? What's the problem with that? It's not. You have asked me to answer an impossible question. You have asked me to judge something that the Bible is completely silent on. Why should I have to do that? Well, the truth of the matter is I shouldn't have to do that. When God says to do something and he says why, that should be enough, right? It's as simple as that, and a lot of people get that. But because of enough religious bias where we've been taught things without other foundational things properly in the mix, we get to the point where it can't compute with some people. It really can't. The idea of baptism and that's a work. That just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't compute because we've misaligned ourselves somewhere way back, and we've lived with it for so long that now we have an impossible situation where the only thing I can say is going to sound very hurtful to somebody. Mm-hmm. I can either say, no, I don't think so. I think you're going to hell. Oh, well, that's nice. That's going to win them over to Jesus. That's going to make them, want to get baptized. And I could say that, or I could just be brutally honest and say, hey, I have no idea. But is that a risk you want to take? Is that something that God would want you to do? Is that how you demonstrate that you truly have repented and have faith in God, by saying, well, God, you didn't say what would happen if I don't. That's not a very impressive form of repentance or faith, in my opinion, but anyway, you guys get the idea, and there are other situations like that. We live in a time, and this is supposed to be a somewhat college-level Bible class, so I guess I'm allowed to say these things, and I need to be able to speak the truth in love, though, and so that's a challenge sometimes. I need to work on that. But
Don't look at me when you say that.
well, Emily's like, don't look over here for that. A lot of churches, and you've heard me talk about this a little bit, but it's become very common today that the majority of church roles are non-biblical roles. And I want to be careful with that, because I'm not going to bash all those roles. I was a youth minister for a long time, and I'm highly in favor of youth ministers. But they're not in the Bible. They're not a biblically ordained role. They're just a practical role, because we need help. We need help with all these kids. Let's hire someone that's gifted in that area. And so churches have youth ministers, family ministers, small group ministers. But if you want to get down to it, as far as the first church, the way it was set up, and the positions that were there, almost everything was different. There were elders, there were deacons. And I think it's okay that there are a lot of these other roles that we have, because I think that's, if the church were here today, translated from back then to now, a lot of the deacons would be like, oh, there's a youth minister, he's a deacon. I consider that like a deacon, because it's very deaconess servant, and that's an area of serving. They're paid deacons in the Bible and stuff like that. But we have a lot of things where we say the minister. What does that mean to most people? Oh yeah, minister. Usually you think that's the guy who's preaching. We could even call him the preacher. I used to do that all the time. Oh yeah, he's the preacher. Well, there's not technically a position called the minister or the preacher in the Bible. There are people who preach, and there are ministers, but you know who ministers are in the Bible? Every single believer, every single Christian is a minister, because we minister to each other all the time. That's what we're supposed to do. So there's the evangelist, which is what Dab will say he is, which what I will say I am, striving to be. But, you look in the Bible and you see a lot of times they were traveling to other congregations too. So that's a challenge that we're going to have to, to try to get in alignment with that. But you go right on down the line, you see nothing is bad about this, but pretty soon a church can say, well, what's our purpose? Let's get together in a group of people in this room and let's decide what our purpose is going to be. And then we'll come up with a purpose statement, because it's a popular thing to do. It works in the business world, and it'll get us in alignment. Now, that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes we can have special goals or special unique purposes, but Christ is the head of the church, and using the analogy of a body, the head pretty much calls the shots, right? The head is what decides things, right? So if you want to pick a purpose, my suggestion would be that's the head's job. That's the brain's job. Brain picks the purpose. Well, if this is Christ's church, it's Christ's purpose. You don't have the luxury of choosing another one. I know that's a harsh thing to say, but I want to be clear. We don't have a right to choose a purpose statement per se, or a purpose or a vision. We have a right to discover what Christ's purpose or vision, and put that in a statement. We have a right to discover what that is for us. But that's not the same thing. We don't get to choose it. Because Christ, the head of the church, he chooses that, and we follow. It's his church. See the difference? But we slowly can drift away, because we put ourselves in a situation where it's slightly outside the will of God, and then the only thing you do can get you into trouble. Don't forget that. That happened way back here, and it still continues to happen today. Verse 12 says, now King David was told, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has, because of the ark of God. So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. Then those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had, when they had taken 6 steps. 6 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Stop! Offered a sacrifice. That talk about treading lightly, right? Talk about reverence and respect. Just move a little bit. Okay, sacrifice now, quick. He hasn't killed anybody yet, right? When they had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sounds of trumpets. David here has become especially reverent. You see, beforehand, he was in a situation where, and this will happen to us too when we align ourselves outside the will of God a little bit, things will go wrong, or we'll be in an impossible situation and not really know what to do. And we'll think, God, why are you doing this? Why are you letting me down? I don't understand. I'm just confused. I'm at a loss. See, it's not as though God spoke to him through the priest at that moment and said, David, you didn't listen to my law. As far as we know, God didn't do that. God didn't even speak to David. He just let David go on, and David's man after God's own heart feels so disconnected, doesn't know what to do. Why do you think? Why didn't God give him a special revelation at that moment to tell him, David, you shouldn't have used the cart? Why didn't he do that?
I almost feel that maybe God did that to Uzzah because the ark had been away from them for so long, and they were treating it not reverently like they should have.
Mm-hmm.
Let's make a point. Right?
Okay.
And then
Killing tends to get attention, I've learned. Not from experience, just so you know, not from experience. But yeah, definitely. Well, God sure made a point, right?
and it even affected David. I mean, he didn't necessarily go to him, but he is feeling
Okay.
scared.
So Emily, now that we know a little bit more of the way you think, you're saying that God orchestrated a situation where he could kill someone to get people's attention? I'm putting it in bad words, on purpose.
I'm thinking something else. Maybe
Yeah.
God was very happy with Asa
Mm-hmm.
and for rescuing the ark that
Mhm.
he took him up to heaven.
Yeah, you could think that. You sure could, except the only reason why I don't is because of verse 7. That verse 7 leads me to assume that that must not be the case because it says the Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. So that's the only reason why. Otherwise, you would have to have that as an option too. But there's the other thing. Does God need to repeat himself? Does God need to repeat himself? No, he doesn't need to repeat himself. He already said it. So God doesn't need to just bring up another brand new revelation. All you got to do is go back and look at the one that he already gave, and the answer's right there. This is another thing. There are a lot of people that really want, a special word from God. God, speak to me. Tell me what I need to do. And I would submit to you, a lot of times, God's not going to do that. You know why? He already spoke to you, and he already told you what to do. It's been sitting around for 1,000+ years. Why don't you go look at it? He's already done it. He does not need to repeat himself. And parents, you can relate to that, right? You don't need to, I shouldn't have to repeat myself. We do it anyway, but we shouldn't have to, right? So, I think that's what's going on there. But now David's genuinely overjoyed. We're bringing the ark back, and he's doing it the right way. 1 Chronicles 15:26. 1 Chronicles 15:26 tells us that here he did it right. He used Levites instead of soldiers. Instead of getting the army to transport it like you would any other precious cargo, he did it the way God did. That implies to me that he not only made just random changes, he probably went back and researched the law and realized, wow, we didn't do it right at all. So he got Levites instead of soldiers. That's what 1 Chronicles 15, verse 26 tells us. And he is genuinely overjoyed at the thought of the ark being in Jerusalem. So it's a good change that he made. But it's interesting. He was one of those guys that he showed his joy very openly, outwardly, for everyone to see. And that gets people's attention. And there are some people that don't like that so much. For a long time, I was one of those people too. And I still will be made uncomfortable at times. But for a long time, I was one of those people like, we're singing a song. Where's your hand doing in the air? Look at me, everyone. Hi, I'm here. I'm worshiping God with my music. It bothered me. And then I kind of changed. I wondered, you know what? Not everyone's trying to get attention. But some people are bothered by that sort of public thing. Verse 16 says, as the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, cake of raisins to each person in the crowd of Israelites, both men and women. And the people went into their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, also his wife, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants as any vulgar fellow would. David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this. Song there. And I will be humiliated in my own eyes, but by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Now, most people, when they read this, give Michal a hard time for what she did. And the way it ends sure kind of makes it sound like, sounds like punishment there, Michal. You shouldn't have spoken such a harsh, mean thing. You know, you're such a naysayer at this time. And that is definitely a common way to take it. And most people who are probably in music ministry, a lot of people are going to use this verse. They love I'll become more undignified than this. I'll dance before the Lord, you know, be excited. They love this passage for that, but I think we need to be careful because this is not a clear passage. This is not one of those decisive, like, yes, this is what God's looking for passages. It is very ambiguous. It leaves a lot of questions to be asked. And Doc Smith, one of my professors, he later on wrote an article about it. It's free on his website, but he calls it something like an open apology to Michal or something like that. He's convinced that she was not wrong at all, that she was actually in the right. And I can get that to you if you want. He lays out a whole bunch of different reasons, little things, because there's not much that you can really go on here. But the things to be said are this. David is not really naked. He's got garments on, all right? He's just not wearing his royal robes. So he's pulling like, I don't know, the wife beater that Chris Cart wears all the time or whatever. You know what I mean? He's just real relaxed, whoa, those are your PJs, come on, we're in public here. Look dignified. And so he's pulling that. And so she is bothered by the way that he is, but if you're married to someone, they can often be bothered by the way you dress too, if you tend to not care about that and the other person tends to care about that. I married into that situation. I'll let you figure out who's who if you want, but you can think about that on your own. Yeah. So anyway, that can happen. Also, David's response, if we want to be honest, it's a little over the top, isn't it? A little bit of, excuse me, you're not king. God didn't even choose you. And it does sound like, he sounds like, you know what, I don't care. God's great. I'll be even more undignified than this in front of him. I'm going to celebrate before the Lord. If that's all he said, great. But he goes on and then the arrow right back to him. But by these slave girls and everyone else you're talking about, I will have my respect. That's a little selfish. Good or bad, whatever, it's still selfish. The attention is pointed at himself, right? So, just not sure. Sometimes things are not appropriate in public, and it's not a good idea. And you know what I mean? And so I don't think we should just immediately jump to the assumption that we know one person was right and the other was wrong. You got to look into it more carefully and see what you think. I don't know that I fully know the answer either way, but I am swayed a little bit to some of the points that that Doc Smith makes here.
Do you think Michal was taken away from David, was given to another man in marriage, and it was a while before he sent for her? He already had other wives first.
Mm-hmm.
Bring her back to me.
Mm-hmm.
Her new husband was crying the whole way behind her,
Yeah.
which makes me think that they were probably fairly close.
Mm-hmm.
And now she's back with David, probably not too happy.
Yeah.
So between the two of them, they probably knew.
Do you sense some marital strife going on there? Yeah, that's a recipe for one, that's for sure. Yeah, I do think that's probably a part of this too. Just the real question is, obviously the two are probably going to be at odds, and obviously, Michal is upset, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one is right or the other is wrong. You know what I mean? Just because of that, yeah.
And she didn't go with the rest of the crowd and the people to go bring the ark, and so I wonder if David's other wives said that she was still at home. So I wonder if in a way she didn't care about it or didn't value it, or maybe she was just too proper to go, or I don't know what. But it seems like she wasn't really participating and celebrating and caring about that either.
That's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't think about that. Well, that's interesting. I don't want to delay anymore. Any other questions or thoughts about that? All right. Well, we need to make some chronology notes here before we move on. Some stuff that we will not be covering in our study, but I'll go ahead and let you jot it down so you can have it, is the following. 1 Chronicles chapter 16. 1 Chronicles chapter 16, what's going to happen there is David is going to appoint priests. David is going to appoint gatekeepers. David is going to also appoint musicians. And he is going to reinstitute morning and evening sacrifices. So in 1 Chronicles 16, a quick summary of that passage would be David appointing priests, gatekeepers, musicians, and reinstating morning and evening sacrifices. So this is good progress. This is great highlights of what David is up to. God is blessing him. So that's 1 Chronicles chapter 16. Next, you can write down 2 Samuel chapter 8. 2 Samuel 8, 15 through 18. 2 Samuel 8, 15 through 18. And 1 Chronicles chapter 26 and chapter 27. 1 Chronicles 26 and 27. So 2 Samuel 8, 15 through 18, and 1 Chronicles 26 and chapter 27. This lists out a bunch of positions that David instituted for the land. And I'll break it down here in this 5, okay? First, we have treasury officers. Next, we have military officers. Then we have tribal officers. So we've got treasury, we've got military, we've got tribal. Then we have overseers of property. Overseers of property would be number 4. And then the 5th one would be counselors. So treasury officers, military officers, tribal officers, overseers of property, and counselors. And, I don't want to say anything in the Bible is less important, but for time constraints, I'm going to move on past that. But these are just some of the things. You get the idea, the overall narrative. Things are going well for David, and he is setting up these positions, reinstituting sacrifices. Things are good. We are going to pick up in chapter 8, 2 Samuel chapter 8. So coming from chapter 6, that's just 2 chapters ahead. And in the 8th chapter of 2 Samuel, when somebody's there, just read the first verse for me.
In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Metheg from the control of the Philistines.
Excellent. Now, there are other parts of Scripture where we can see more specifically how this took place. But basically, one of the things that's really cool about what's going on here is that the race of giants that were inhabiting the land of Canaan for many, many years were dying out. Remember, that's the very reason that the Israelites came in and had to wander in the wilderness, because they were too afraid to fight, because giants big and tall, you know. That's what they saw. So because of that, they had to wander, and now they're back. Well, a lot of those giants are finally dying out over time. And what's interesting, and I never made this connection, but studying after a while, it kind of hit me too. The Philistines are a constant problem, right? Just when you think things are getting better, they get worse again. Saul, at the beginning of his reign, well, not just at the beginning, but later on into the middle of his reign, he was having a serious problem with the Philistines because they had a super giant, mighty man slayer named Goliath, who was out there challenging the people. And it wasn't until God used David to come and slay him that the Philistines were drawn back. And then it seemed like, man, great victory again. And Saul had a good reign. But then how did Saul die? At the hands of who? The Philistines. So they were still a problem that never seemed to go away. They're constantly an issue. And how did that happen? Well, it seems as though the Philistines would rally to a man, to a giant. Goliath was their man. Goliath brought down, they ran away, they were scattered, they were done. Well, David defeats the Philistines again, and he took control of this particular, and he took Metheg-Ammah from the control of the Philistines. It seems like what they would do is they would find their next giant, their next champion, their next leader, and they would come up and they would be a problem again. And so the areas where the giants are starting to, where they were living, are now being defeated. That implies that the giants are starting to die out. And so it's kind of cool that God is finally winning, which is a lesson in and of itself as far as who you're going to side with, God or with a man. There are some great men out there, and those great men are pretty good. They'll take you places. These Philistines won a lot of battles. They did not win the war, though, because they trusted in their giant men. Definitely not really in their God, because their fish god kept falling over anyway. He wasn't worth much. But they did not trust in the one true God. Can somebody flip to 2 Samuel 21 for us real quick? Verses 16 through 22. If someone could read that real quick, that would be helpful. 2 Samuel 21, verses 16 through 22.
Enishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha, whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels and was armed with a new sword, he said he would kill David. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to David's rescue. He struck the Philistine down and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, saying, "Never again will you go out with us to battle, so that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished." In the course of time, there was another battle with the Philistines at Gob. At that time, Sibekah the Hushathite killed Saph, one of the descendants of Rapha. In another battle with the Philistines at Gob, Elhanan, son of Jerioram, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath, the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. In still another battle which took place at Gath, there was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He also was a descendant from Rapha. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of Shimeah, David's brother, killed him. These 4 were descendants of Rapha and Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men.
Wonderful. Thank you for reading those crazy names too. But that's to reinforce what we've been saying. The Philistines would rally around their giant, and then that's probably why in 2 Samuel 21 there at the end, the Bible records the giant being killed by this person or by that person, because it would put the Philistines at bay again. Then the next person would come up, giant after giant, and it would be slayed by one of David's men. So, and remember, David himself was a mighty man too. All right, back to chapter 8, verse 2 and following says, David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground. Ooh, this sounds bad. Here we go. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. Moreover, David defeated Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah, when he went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. Now, it says a whole lot about who you are if you are more bothered by the killing of 2 out of 3 men or the hamstringing of the horses. I think that speaks about you, personally. But regardless, both of those are issues that might bother people, so let's talk about them. How David treated the Moabites. It sounds very harsh. That's because it is very harsh, but it's very harsh in and of itself. It is not very harsh compared to what they deserved. Even though we're looking at this from a very harsh perspective, probably this is one of the more gracious things that could be done for them. They were probably people bad enough that should have all been wiped out. Probably. They were some of the worst people. They were the people that their worship involved a god, an idol with flaming hands, and you were supposed to take your little baby and melt it. Just throw it on the flaming hands of their god and just burn babies. That was who these people were. So punishment does kind of fit the crime here. They probably deserve to be completely wiped out. But David kills 2 out of 3. Now, one thing that is also interesting here is the way he does it. Why do it that way? I just want to offer a theory. It may or may not be right, obviously, but laying them out 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, laying them all out and killing 2, leaving 1, that's random as far as we're concerned. It is not random as far as God's concerned, because God knows everything and he knows the sequence of who all's going to be out there. Many times God used the lots. In Old Testament days, he would let them cast lots and he would work through that to give them a direction. What should we do? They would cast the lot and God would decide, I'm going to answer them with that. In the case of Jonah, he used that so that those people didn't even know better, but they still cast lots and God used the lots. Well, casting lots is like throwing the dice. It's random to us, but not to God. God can orchestrate that. Perhaps that's what God was doing. Think about that. You have an entire civilization of horrible people that have a horrible idol they worship. They deserve death, but deep down there are some of them that maybe don't deserve it so much as others do. But there's no way we or David or any man could ever really know that. Just no way. But God sees the heart. He knows. So I would suggest to you that maybe God used this as a means of orchestrating it so that 1/3 of the people who were not as sinful as the others could be spared. That's just my theory on this. I think that's probably what God did. He probably orchestrated that. Also, a lot of times, you could... does your translation say about the horses anything different than... Mine says hamstrung. He hamstrung the horses. Does yours say anything different than that?
What verse was that?
That's verse 4. The last part of verse 4. He captured 1,000 chariots, 7,000 charioteers, 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. Okay, hamstrung. Yeah, well, all that really means, I was looking at it, it's not a super specific word as best I can tell. The word literally means to render useless or ineffective. So it's not even saying that he necessarily lamed all the horses, but he made it so, whatever he did to them, he made it so they cannot be used to pull chariots in the army anymore. That was what he did, because Israel did not have a big army of horsemen and charioteers and stuff, so it was not beneficial to them. But rather than killing the horses or completely laming them, he did something that would involve weakening them or something to keep them from being used in battle as a chariot horse. So that's probably what he did. So it's not, yeah, crippled, huh? Okay. Yeah, in some way he probably did that to some extent. The Bible does talk about treatment of animals. You know, I think our society blows that out of proportion a bit, but what is it? Proverbs talks about blessed is the man, or good is the man who has regard for the life of his beast. It's almost like talking about it, it's an animal, you know. At the end of Jonah, God says, you know, how could Jonah, how could you be so selfish to care about this tree, but you don't care about the whole city of Nineveh that has all these people and a whole bunch of cattle? Well, why'd God throw that in? Cattle. Because God cares about animals too. He's not for mistreatment of animals, so keep that in mind. Okay, 5 and following. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 of them. I'm blowing past these numbers like they're insignificant, but that's huge. 22,000 of them. He put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. From Tebah and Berothai, towns that belonged to Hadadezer, King David took a great quantity of bronze. When Tou, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent out his son Joram to King David to greet him and to congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tou. Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. King David dedicated these articles to the Lord, as he had done with the silver and the gold from all the nations he had subdued. Edom and Moab, the Ammonites, and the Philistines, and Amalek. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. Now, David was not a believer apparently in the 10% tithe. He's giving almost everything. Apparently everything he gets, he is giving it to God. This is a man after God's own heart. What does that man after God's own heart do? He gives almost everything to God. He does not just settle for 10%. Truth of the matter is, everything's God's anyway. It's 100% his. And when you get that kind of, idea locked in your head, it's really great, because when a natural disaster comes and destroys your house, you just look up to heaven and say, God, look what they did to your house. I'm so sorry. It's a nice little paradigm shift, because it's all God's anyway, right? However, I would suggest to you that 10% probably isn't enough. That's a good starting point. I don't want to rule that out or anything. And the word tithe means 10%. But the way in the Old Testament, Doc Smith did a good job of calculating this. 10% is only 10% when you take it from, the pile at one time and that's it. It's not 10% if you say, okay, I'll take 10% of that. Now come over here, give me another 10% of that and another 10% of that. All of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, we've just done more than 10% here. If you collect it more often, then it would equal more. So he calculated the times that the tithe was taken in the Old Testament when it was mandated from the crops and everything. And as best he could estimate it was about 1/6. About 1/6 of a person's income was taken in the Old Testament tithes. So that's a good basis for us to think about. If it was 1/6 in the Old Testament, well, how much do you appreciate God? It's free will. It's up to you, But there's not, 10% is kind of artificial in my mind, just so you know. It's just kind of a thing that we've been taught, but maybe we need to think more in greater terms, Anyway, just throwing that out there. Finish this up. And David, verse 13, became famous as he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. Now, All right, running out of time. There's a note that needs to be taken here. The Masoretic text actually reads Arameans instead of Edomites. So it says Arameans, but we're going to guess that this is probably a scribal error. Every great once in a while, those things happen when you're handwriting, materials and stuff. A scribe might have made a mistake, and the reason for that is because the Hebrew word for Edom and Arameans, the Hebrew words look almost identical. So it's an easy mistake that could have been made, but it's just not likely at this time in this location that the Arameans would have that much of an army to be taken out. So Edomites makes more sense. Also, 1 Chronicles 18:12 says Edom. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of this Hebrew Old Testament, it also reads Edom as well. So the fact that one of the Hebrew texts says the Arameans, it's probably just a scribal mistake. We have other evidence, and the parallel passage in Chronicles says otherwise. David reigned over all Israel, verse 15, doing what is right and just and fair for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Sariah was secretary. Benaniah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites. And David's sons were priests. Now, this is interesting. David's sons were priests. I wanted to look into that because I thought, hold on a second. How could they be Aaronic priests? They're not in the right family. They're not. The term for priest actually had a generic sense. A generic sense, at least at this time. Later on, I think it became more specific. And it was used more generally to mean an official, a court official. So David's sons being priests, here what we're probably talking about is they were officials in his court officials. That's probably what we're getting at. And that Septuagint again, the Greek translation that Jesus quoted, that was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, it says that they were priests of the court, which is another way of saying court officials as well.
The NIV says royal advisors.
Royal advisors, okay, and that's probably why they're saying that, because it is the word for priests, which is interesting, because the word for priest is Kohen, and it's where the name Cohen today kind of originates from. And my professor was telling me that a lot of times, even in certain Jewish synagogues or whatever, if there's a person that randomly shows up that their last name is Cohen, they would call on them to, I don't remember if it's read or to pray or to, maybe to have the reading, because they have special respect for that name because of the word that means priest, and they still hold some regard for that, which is interesting. Any questions from everything we've discussed so far? Kind of had to fly through this at the end, so. All right. Okay, let's pray. God, thank you for making us priests. It's the reason why I'm able to talk to you right now, and for it to mean something. Thank you for your Spirit who's inside of us, and he's helping us. He's making us better, and right now, hopefully, because we've intensely looked at your word, he's using that to do some changing and some tweaking and some adjusting that needs to happen. And God, please don't let us grieve him or get in the way of it. Give us the heart that David had, and give us the diligence to change when we need to and to persevere when we need to as well. Thank you for the people here who've gathered, not just in this room, in the other room. Thank you for the encouragement that we have to do these midweek studies with each other. And God, please help, just help your word to be more and more known by your people. And it's in your son's name I pray. Thank you guys.
American family didn't get him.